On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and 300 million people woke up the next morning as citizens of countries that had barely existed 24 hours earlier. In Moscow, a 40-year-old economist named Yegor Gaidar was about to be handed the most terrifying assignment in modern economic history: dismantle a 70-year-old command economy overnight, with no instruction manual and no safety net. But how do you transform a superpower into a functioning market democracy when the shelves are already empty, the treasury is bankrupt, and the people trusted to carry out the reforms are the same apparatchiks who ran the old system? To understand what Russia looked like in those first months after the collapse, you have to understand what the collapse actually felt like on the ground. It was not a single dramatic explosion. It was more like the slow buckling of a building whose foundations had been rotting for years until one day the ceiling simply came down. By late 1991, the Soviet state had already been hemorrhaging authority for months. The Baltic republics had declared independence. Ukraine had voted overwhelmingly to leave. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who had tried to reform communism and accidentally destroyed it, was a president without a country. His rival, Boris Yeltsin, the hard-drinking, unpredictable populist who had stood on a tank outside the Russian White House during the August coup attempt, was now the most powerful man in Russia. But power in that moment was a strange and almost meaningless word. Yeltsin controlled a state that could barely feed itself. The numbers were staggering. By the end of 1991, Soviet GDP had been falling for 3 consecutive years. Inflation was accelerating. The ruble was nearly worthless on the black market. Foreign currency reserves were virtually gone. The country owed roughly $70 billion in external debt and could not service the payments. Grain reserves were so low that Western governments were shipping emergency food aid to Moscow and St. Petersburg, a humiliation that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier, when the Soviet Union had maintained the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. And this was only the beginning. What happened next would make 1991 look like a period of relative stability. If you find yourself fascinated by these kinds of hidden mechanics behind the Soviet collapse, the decisions no one talks about, the human stories buried inside the geopolitics, then consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the real history of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and the Cold War, the kind of history that explains how the world we live in today was actually built. One click, and you are part of that project. Yeltsin's most consequential early decision was his choice of economic team. He turned not to seasoned Soviet bureaucrats, but to a group of young, Western-oriented economists who had been studying market economics in academic seminars, while the rest of the country stood in breadlines. Yegor Gaidar, at just 35 when he first began advising Yeltsin, became the architect of what would be called shock therapy. The idea was brutally simple in theory: remove price controls, liberalize trade, privatize state enterprises, let the market set values. The logic came partly from the example of Poland, where Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz had implemented rapid reforms in 1990, with painful but arguably successful results. Gaidar and his allies, including Anatoly Chubais, who would later oversee privatization, believed that gradual reform was impossible in Russia. The old system was too broken to be slowly converted. You had to leap across the chasm in one jump, because no one had ever crossed it in two. On January 2, 1992, just 8 days after the Soviet flag came down, Gaidar's team released price controls on roughly 90% of consumer goods and 80% of producer goods. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Prices did not merely rise, they erupted. Within the first month, consumer prices jumped by 250%. By the end of 1992, inflation would reach approximately 2,600%. Imagine waking up on a Monday morning and discovering that your life savings, the money you had carefully set aside over decades of work in a Soviet factory or hospital or school, could now buy a few bags of groceries. That is not a hypothetical. That is what happened to tens of millions of Russians in the first quarter of 1992. Elderly pensioners were hit hardest. Many had no way to supplement their income. Some were reduced to selling personal belongings on the street, standing in freezing temperatures outside metro stations in Moscow and St. Petersburg, holding out old war medals, family china, used clothing, anything that might bring in a few rubles that would themselves be worth less by the end of the week. The physical landscape of Russian cities began to change almost immediately. State shops, the old Soviet magazini with their sparse shelves and surly clerks, started to empty out entirely or close altogether. In their place, a wild, chaotic form of commerce emerged. Kiosks appeared on sidewalks, in underpasses, near train stations, small metal or wooden structures selling everything from imported candy bars and cigarettes to vodka and counterfeit blue jeans. Street markets, called rinki, expanded rapidly, often operating in a legal gray zone. Babushkas lined the roadside selling vegetables from their garden plots, pickled goods, and homemade preserves. The visual shift was jarring. Where there had once been a dreary but predictable order, a grim Soviet tidiness, there was now a sprawling, noisy, slightly desperate commercial free-for-all. And behind the kiosks, behind the improvised capitalism, was an emerging force that would come to define 1990s Russia perhaps more than any economic policy: organized crime. Here is a detail that often gets lost in the grand narrative of post-Soviet transition. By 1993, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs estimated that roughly 40,000 private businesses in Russia were paying protection money to criminal organizations. Some estimates ran much higher. The reason was structural. When you dismantle a command economy, but do not yet have functioning courts, enforceable contract law, reliable police, or a transparent banking system, someone still has to enforce agreements and settle disputes. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party and the planning apparatus had performed that function, however corruptly. Now the party was gone, the planners were gone, and into that vacuum stepped the Vori Zakoni, the so-called thieves in law, along with a new generation of violent entrepreneurial criminal gangs. In cities like Moscow, Yekaterinburg, and Vladivostok, gang wars over commercial territory became a routine feature of daily life. Car bombings, contract killings, shootouts in restaurants. The murder rate in Russia roughly doubled between 1990 and 1994. Russia in those years had a homicide rate that rivaled or exceeded that of the most violent countries in the Western Hemisphere. But the crime wave, as terrifying as it was for ordinary Russians, was only one dimension of a much larger unraveling. The social fabric itself was coming apart. Consider the statistics on public health alone, because they tell a story that no economic theory can fully capture. Male life expectancy in Russia, which had been around 64 years in 1990, dropped to just 57 years by 1994. That is a collapse without parallel in any industrialized nation during peacetime. The causes were multiple and intertwined: skyrocketing alcohol consumption, particularly of cheap, often toxic homemade spirits, a surge in cardiovascular disease linked to stress, poor diet, and alcohol, rising rates of suicide, homicide, and accidental death, the deterioration of the public health system as funding evaporated and doctors and nurses went unpaid for months at a time. Hospitals ran short of basic supplies. In some regions, medicines simply vanished from pharmacies. The psychological toll was enormous. Surveys from the period show widespread feelings of hopelessness, betrayal, and disorientation. People who had spent their entire lives within a system that, whatever its faults, had provided a basic framework of meaning, a job, a place in society, an ideology however hollowed out, now found themselves adrift in a world that seemed to operate by rules no one had explained to them. And then came privatization, the process that would create the oligarchs and reshape Russian society for decades to come. This is where the story takes its most consequential turn. Anatoly Chubas, a young reformer from St. Petersburg with an economist's faith in market mechanisms and a politician's instinct for speed, was tasked with transferring the vast state-owned industrial base into private hands. The challenge was immense. The Soviet state had owned everything: factories, mines, oil fields, airlines, hotels, farms. How do you distribute this wealth fairly to a population of 150 million people who have never owned private property and have no capital to invest? Shubas devised a scheme that on paper sounded almost egalitarian. Every Russian citizen would receive a voucher, a privatization check worth 10,000 rubles, roughly the equivalent of $25 at the time, which they could use to buy shares in privatized enterprises or invest through voucher investment funds. The program launched in October 1992. What happened next was predictable to some and devastating to many. Most ordinary Russians had no understanding of stock markets, share ownership, or investment. They were hungry, confused, and broke. Many sold their vouchers almost immediately for cash, sometimes for as little as the price of a bottle of vodka. Others invested in voucher funds that turned out to be fraudulent or incompetently managed. The vouchers concentrated rapidly in the hands of people who did understand their potential value: former factory managers, black market operators, well-connected insiders, and a small number of extraordinarily aggressive young businessmen who would soon become some of the richest people on the planet. This was the birth of the oligarch class. Men like Boris Berezovsky, a former mathematician turned car dealer turned media mogul. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who leveraged connections within the Young Communist League into control of a bank, and eventually the massive oil company Yukos. Vladimir Potanin, a former Soviet trade official who would engineer one of the most controversial deals in modern financial history. Vladimir Gusinsky, who built a media empire. These men, and a handful of others, would come to control staggering portions of Russia's natural resources and industrial capacity within just a few years. The mechanism that turbocharged this concentration of wealth was the Loans for Shares scheme of 1995, and it deserves particular attention because it remains one of the most audacious transfers of public wealth to private hands ever documented. By 1995, the Russian government was desperate for revenue. Yeltsin was facing a presidential election the following year, the war in Chechnya was draining the treasury, and tax collection had essentially collapsed. Potanin proposed a deal. A group of private banks would lend the government money, and in return they would receive shares in some of Russia's most valuable state-owned enterprises as collateral. If the government failed to repay the loans, which everyone involved knew it would, the banks would keep the shares. The auctions were rigged. The banks essentially bought colossal enterprises at a fraction of their true value. Potanin's bank acquired a controlling stake in Norilsk Nickel, one of the world's largest mining companies, for about $170 million. Its market value would later be estimated in the tens of billions. Khodorkovsky's group acquired Yukos, a major oil company, for approximately $309 million. Within a few years, Yukos alone would be worth tens of billions as well. The Russian public, which nominally owned these assets, received almost nothing. The political consequences were equally profound. The oligarchs who had acquired these assets now had an enormous incentive to keep Yeltsin in power, because their ownership claims depended on the continuation of the political order that had granted them. In the 1996 presidential election, Yeltsin was trailing badly in the polls, with the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov leading by significant margins in early surveys. The oligarchs intervened massively. They provided financing, media coverage through their television channels and newspapers, and organizational support. Berezovsky was particularly brazen, openly boasting to the Financial Times that a group of 7 bankers controlled 50% of the Russian economy. Yeltsin won re-election in a runoff, despite visibly deteriorating health, having apparently suffered a heart attack between the 2 rounds of voting, a fact that was concealed from the public at the time. The relationship between wealth and political power in Russia had been forged, and it would prove impossible to break cleanly. Meanwhile, outside Moscow, in the vast Russian hinterland, the picture was often even grimmer. In industrial cities that had been built around a single factory or a single industry, the collapse of state orders meant the collapse of everything. Entire cities lost their economic reason for being. In the closed nuclear cities, the so-called secret cities that did not appear on Soviet maps, scientists and engineers who had maintained the nuclear arsenal found themselves unpaid for months. Western governments scrambled to fund cooperative threat reduction programs, terrified that nuclear materials or expertise might leak to rogue states or terrorist groups. In the agricultural regions, collective farms disintegrated but were not replaced by functioning private agriculture. Output plummeted. In Siberia and the Russian Far East, some communities became almost entirely cut off from the central government as transportation subsidies were eliminated and air routes were cancelled. People in remote settlements found themselves stranded, unable to leave even if they wanted to, surviving on hunting, fishing, and whatever they could grow in short subarctic growing seasons. The military, once the pride and terror of the Soviet state, experienced its own form of disintegration. Funding for the armed forces collapsed. Soldiers went unpaid. Equipment rusted. Training exercises were cancelled for lack of fuel. Officers sold weapons and supplies on the black market to feed their families. The hazing culture within the Russian military, known as dedovshchina, became even more brutal as institutional discipline broke down. Conscripts were beaten, starved, and in some documented cases, driven to suicide or murder. The armed forces that had once projected power across half the globe could not even properly supply their own garrisons. And then there was Chechnya. In December 1994, Yeltsin ordered Russian forces into the breakaway Republic of Chechnya, launching a war that would become one of the defining catastrophes of his presidency and of 1990s Russia more broadly. The first assault on the Chechen capital, Grozny, on New Year's Eve 1994, was a disaster of almost incomprehensible proportions. Columns of Russian armored vehicles rolled into the city with inadequately trained conscript crews, some of whom reportedly did not even know where they were being sent. Chechen fighters, many of them veterans of the Soviet military, ambushed the columns in the narrow streets. The Russian 131st Maikop Motor Rifle Brigade was virtually annihilated. Estimates suggest that the brigade lost more than 800 men killed, wounded, or captured in the first 72 hours. Grozny was reduced to rubble in the weeks that followed, with massive civilian casualties. The war dragged on until 1996, costing tens of thousands of lives, and ended in a humiliating Russian withdrawal that solved nothing and set the stage for a second, even more brutal conflict that would begin in 1999. The psychological impact of the Chechen War on Russian society was immense. Television footage of burning Russian tanks and dead conscripts shattered whatever remaining confidence the public had in the government and the military. Soldiers' mothers organized protest movements. Journalists who covered the war, most notably Anna Politkovskaya, documented atrocities committed by both sides. The war also became a crucible of corruption, with military commanders reportedly selling weapons to the very Chechen fighters they were supposed to be fighting. It was a mirror reflecting every pathology of 1990s Russia: institutional decay, corruption, incompetence, and a profound disconnect between the leadership in Moscow and the reality on the ground. By the mid-1990s, the cumulative effect of all these forces had produced a society in a state of deep trauma. The Russian economy had contracted by roughly 40% from its 1989 level, a decline deeper than the Great Depression in the United States. Poverty was widespread. Inequality had exploded from near zero, at least officially, under the Soviet system to levels comparable to Latin America. Corruption permeated every level of government and business. The democratic institutions that reformers had hoped to build were being hollowed out by oligarchic influence, executive overreach, and public cynicism. And there was one more crisis yet to come. In August 1998, the Russian financial system collapsed. The ruble, which the government had been propping up through high-interest borrowing, crashed. The government defaulted on its domestic debt. Banks froze deposits. The ruble lost roughly 75% of its value against the dollar in a matter of weeks. Russians who had managed to save anything through the previous years of turmoil now lost it all over again. For many, this was the third devastating financial shock in less than a decade after the hyperinflation of 1992 and the pyramid scheme collapses of the mid-1990s, the most notorious being MMM, a Ponzi scheme run by a con artist named Sergei Mavrodi that had defrauded millions of Russians. The 1998 crash deepened the already pervasive sense that the new Russia was a rigged game, that democracy and capitalism were not the promised paths to prosperity, but rather elaborate mechanisms for the connected few to steal from everyone else. It is worth pausing here to consider a striking paradox. The 1998 crash, as devastating as it was in the short term, actually set the stage for Russia's subsequent economic recovery. The devalued ruble made Russian exports, particularly oil and gas, far more competitive on world markets. Just as the crisis hit, global oil prices began to rise from their late 1990s lows. Russian domestic producers, no longer competing against artificially cheap imports, began to recover. GDP growth turned positive in 1999 for the first time in a decade. But the political consequences of the entire 1990s experience would prove far more significant than any economic statistic. On December 31, 1999, Boris Yeltsin appeared on Russian television and announced his resignation, effective immediately. He was visibly emotional, aged far beyond his years, his health ruined by heart disease, and many suspected alcohol. He asked the Russian people for forgiveness. He said he was sorry that many of the hopes they had shared had not come true, that what seemed simple had turned out to be agonizingly difficult. His designated successor was a man most Russians had barely heard of 6 months earlier, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer from St. Petersburg who had risen through the bureaucracy with remarkable speed. Putin had been appointed prime minister in August 1999 and had immediately taken a hard line on Chechnya, ordering a second military campaign that was, in its early stages, broadly popular with a Russian public exhausted by chaos and humiliation. The Russia that Putin inherited was not the Russia of 1991. It was a country that had been through a decade of what many Russians experienced as catastrophe. The generation that came of age during the 1990s had internalized a set of lessons that would profoundly shape Russia's political trajectory for the next quarter century. They learned that rapid democratization had led to chaos, that Western-style capitalism, at least as it had been implemented, meant corruption and inequality, that a weak state meant a predatory state, one that could not protect its citizens from crime, poverty, or humiliation. Whether these lessons were accurate or fair is a separate question. What matters is that they were deeply felt, and they created a political environment in which a leader who promised order, stability, and national dignity would find an enormous and receptive audience. The story of Russia after the Soviet collapse is often told as a story of reform gone wrong, or of Western naivety, or of Russian cultural pathology, but none of these framings quite capture the full picture. What happened in Russia in the 1990s was an experiment conducted at civilizational scale, an attempt to transform every institution and every assumption of a society simultaneously. Under conditions of extreme resource scarcity, institutional collapse, and geopolitical upheaval. The experiment produced winners, a handful of spectacularly wealthy oligarchs, a new middle class in Moscow and a few other major cities, Russians who were able to travel, consume, and express themselves freely for the first time. But it also produced losers on a massive scale, and the losers vastly outnumbered the winners. The pensioners who froze in unheated apartments, the factory workers who went unpaid for a year, the soldiers who bled in Grozny for reasons no one could coherently explain, the scientists who left Russia or left science, the children who grew up in a world of instability and violence that their parents could never have imagined. Every nation that undergoes revolutionary transformation pays a price in human suffering, and the price is never distributed equally. The Russian 1990s are a reminder that the mechanics of transition, the specific policies chosen, the sequence in which reforms are implemented, the strength or weakness of institutions meant to protect the vulnerable. These are not abstract technical questions. They are questions of life and death, of dignity and despair, of whether a society's most painful passage leads eventually to something better or merely to a different form of authoritarianism justified by the memory of chaos. The echoes of that decade are still shaping the world today. In Russia's political system, in its relationship with the West, in the calculations of leaders who watched a superpower dissolve and drew their own conclusions about the fragility of order and the uses of power. What Russia was like right after the collapse of the USSR was not simply a country in transition. It was a warning, etched in the lives of millions, about what happens when an empire falls and no one has a plan for what comes next.